Old-timers who settled in Mancos Valley relate that, with John Moss, the earliest pioneers were H.M. Smith and Peter Lindstrom of Denver, and 7 other gold seekers from California: James Ratliff, A.L. Root, Dick Giles, Harry Lee, Ed Merrick, John Brewer, and Fred Franks, all but Moss engaged by a San Francisco banking house to prospect for gold and silver. Not many months passed before these men were joined by a few ranchers and cowboys, lured by the valley's grasslands. They in turn attracted others, and the population grew rapidly. The newcomers planted cleared fields to corn and wheat, built their cabins of squared fir logs in the mountain foothills, and fed well on deer, elk, and bear. Winters were bitterly cold, with snow sometimes falling to a depth of 30 inches. Spring thaws and rain, melting snows off the slopes, usually kept the valleys green through the hot months, but not always. Occasionally there were periods of drought when crops withered, stock grew. The earliest settlers diverted water from the Mancos and Dolores rivers into networks of laboriously constructed irrigation ditches. The greatest concern of the settlers, however, was the increasingly hostile attitude of the Utes. When the whites showed no disposition to move on, the Indians ordered them away. Finally, because the settlers remained, one incident followed another, spreading alarm throughout the valley. First it was a cow or a steer found dead on the range, only its tongue cut out, or just enough hide peeled off for 1 pair of moccasin soles. Then, as these warnings failed, the Utes contemplated sterner measures. Meanwhile, with a very few exceptions, the men of Mancos carried 6-shooters, and every cabin had a rifle. Each year brought new families into the valley. In the winter of 1876, seeing the arrival of Reese Richards and his wife, the first white woman in Mancos. More women and children followed soon afterwards. Among them were the wife and 3 children of Andrew Menifee, the wife and 3 boys of David Willis, Joe Moorfield and his wife, and the families of Joe Sheik and Henry Mitchell. They arrived in the summer of 1877. In September of that year, the Andrew Menifee's family, sheltering in a dugout down by the banks of the Mancos, announced the birth of a son, Willie. He was the first white baby born in the settlement, and to celebrate the event, some of the ranchers got together and helped Andy Menifee build a log cabin. After one serious Indian scare, the settlers cut logs in the fall of 1880 for the first schoolhouse and surrounded it with a stockade to which all the families in the valley could come in case the Utes should attack. The school was completed in the spring, and the stockade was finished soon after, but either the settlers' enthusiasm or their alarm petered out before the stockade was closed with a log gate. The gate was never built, and the stockade was never used for defense. Mancos was without a post office until 1881 and lacked any sort of a store until 1883. The settlers in the earlier years hauling all supplies by ox wagon or pack horse from Pueblo, the nearest railroad town. By 1878, the rails were extended to Alamosa, shortening the distance, but still making it difficult to obtain most of the necessities of life, especially in the winter. Mrs. Clara Ormiston, who came to the valley as a child in July 1880, said, "Supplies fell short and some people nearly starved to death in the 1883-84. The winter of deep snow. That winter was all but impossible for a horseman to reach Alamosa," she said, and "we kids went to school with snowshoes, walked right over the tops of fences buried under the snow." Some of the privations were relieved by a newcomer named George Bauer, who had left his job as a bricklayer in Del Norte to become the leading merchant of Mancos, eventually becoming wealthy enough to take his family on trips to Europe. After obtaining a permit to open a post office, he brought in a freight wagon loaded to the axles with general merchandise. Before nightfall, all his stock all but gone, he realized he was established in business. He built the town's first store in 1883, and in the same room with the post office, he opened up a saloon, erecting a partition to separate bar and bottles from postage stamps. Bauer's saloon was hailed uproariously by the men, Clara Ormiston recalled, but regarded coldly by their womenfolk. "But nobody said anything because we all wanted to post office so bad, and after all, there was that partition." Like so many other places in the valley, the Wetherills during their first 2 years had no place of their own. They lived on the ranch of a friendly settler named Costin. Hard work and saving finally made it possible for them to take up a homestead on 160 acres of good land at the head of the valley, 3 miles southwest of town. Here, in 1882, on a gentle rise above the bend of the Mancos River, the first building of Alamo Ranch was raised. A sturdy cabin of square-hewn logs chinked with white clay and covered with a roof of hand-split shingles. The Wetherills commenced work on the first barn, set out cottonwood trees around the cabin, dug an irrigation ditch diagonally across the front yard, and, with a single ox team, cultivated 20 acres of land. When they applied for water claims, the Wetherills were assigned to 13th position on the priority list. As long as the Mancos River ran full, each rancher would draw off as much water for irrigation as he needed. In dry spells, when the river level was lowered, the water each rancher could draw was reduced according to his priority. Since their father's health prevented his sharing the hard labor, Richard and his brothers undertook the major work of developing the ranch. 11 years after the log cabin was built, the Alamo Ranch was one of the most prosperous in the valley and was described by the editor of the Mancos Times. The Alamo Ranch, owned by Mr. B.K. Wetherill, is one of the most beautiful and fertile mountain farms in the West, and Mr. Wetherill and his sons are constantly adding to their acreage. This year they will harvest 200 acres of wheat and 75 acres of oats. With not a dollar at their command when they located in this then bleak and barren-looking country, overrun with Indians and wild game, they now own 1,000 acres of agricultural land and have about 300 acres under a high state of cultivation. Their home is large and commodious and is surrounded by good barns, machinery houses, blacksmith shop, and numerous tenement houses. They have raised 5 hardy, hard-working, and intelligent sons who are perfectly alive to all of the issues of the day. Long since the yoke of oxen have been discarded, and it is now necessary to employ 20 teams of good horses on the ranch. Mr. Wetherill has 2 good ditches and has completed a reservoir, which, when filled, will cover from 6 to 8 acres and will be capable of irrigating an extensive scope of ground. This shows what energy and perseverance will accomplish in the West. And I feel like New York City. Get me to the farm.